Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Geology 109, Evolution of the Earth. This is week 10, and for the lecture content for the week, we're going to be looking at the Middle Paleozoic. So we'll be looking at the Silurian and Devonian periods, very similar to what we did last week with the Cambrian and the Ordovician, where we're looking at each period in terms of life and geology and tectonics. So the Silurian and Devonian periods took place about 440 to 416 and 416 to 359 million years ago, respectively. This is right here in the middle of the Paleozoic. And if you remember, we had a trend in the early Paleozoic of the Cambrian and the Ordovician with increasing sea levels. Yes, we had the regression in between the Sauk and Tippecanoe sequences, but there was still a general trend of sea levels going up. The Cambrian sea levels were high, then they went down, and then the Ordovician went even higher. And then, yes, they do come down and start to go up a little bit again in the Silurian and the Devonian, but the general trend we're seeing in the Middle Paleozoic are lowering sea levels. If we take a look at the world in the Middle Silurian, for example, we notice that we have a pretty large landmass in the southern hemisphere that we're calling Gondwana, and this is really the accumulation of what someday will be Australia, Antarctica, India, Africa, parts of South America. You notice even small remnants of Florida are down there too. Most of what will become North America, what we're still calling Laurentia, or combined with parts of Greenland and Siberia and so on, are still straddling the equator, but we're starting to slowly rotate a little bit counterclockwise. And then by the time we get to the early Devonian, we're looking at a very different world yet again. The Gondwanan continents are starting to shift a little bit more northward, and North America keeps rotating counterclockwise, where our east coast is quickly turning into our east coast. And you'll notice that we are getting slightly closer to Gondwana. Laurasia, or Lauramerica, Euramerica, is starting to get a little bit closer there. So what are some major things going on in the early Devonian, which kind of, middle of this mid-Paleozoic? We have a glaciation in Gondwana. So we have pretty substantial ice sheets in the southern hemisphere supercontinent. So around South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia are starting to be glaciated over. And we're also seeing the end of the Tippecanoe sequence and the slow but steady transgression of the Kaskaskia. So we end the Tippecanoe here, low sea levels, and then we start to raise them up, but they never really get, they do get across the craton, but very briefly. Now, interesting thing happening with the Devonian period, the Silurian going into the Devonian period in what we now call like the Midwest. With the uplift of the Taconic Mountains in the Ordovician, and then subsequent continued mountain building events to continue building up the Appalachians, we have a very unique situation here. So in what is now parts of New England, we have a lot of red bed deposits. So these are going to be sands and gravels and clays and silts that are red in color. And the reason they're red is because they have iron oxide in them, which means these sediments were above sea level when they were deposited, or at least in very shallow water. And that's because these are the sediments that were starting to shed off of those early Appalachian mountains like the Taconic orogeny. This has some interesting ramifications because we have three basins, the Appalachian, the Ohio, and the Michigan. And these basins are tectonically low areas, so they're just slight depressed areas, and that's where sediments feed into. Now, the more sediments you feed into those basins, the more the crust will flex into the mantle to make more space for more sediments. So these, the Michigan Basin, the Ohio Basin, the Appalachian Basin, are literally thousands of meters thick with different types of sedimentary rocks, but it doesn't mean these basins were thousands of meters deep. It's called crustal loading. We keep adding more and more sediment into those basins. Now, these basins are tectonic lows, and what do we have forming around them in the relatively shallow water? These barrier reefs that form the entire area. And then out from there we have limestones with this brick pattern. But these barrier reefs are where we're seeing a lot of corals, but we're also seeing a lot of gypsum and halite. So what's happening is you have a lot of sediment in these basins, and then sea level starts to decrease. Then the barrier reefs form around the basins, and now the water that's in the basin can't go anywhere. It just gets stuck there. So it'd be like a pond that gets kind of landlocked, and so it starts to get very warm and it starts to evaporate. And that's how we end up forming all of these halites and gypsums there. So during the Devonian, this is some of the evidence we have for lowering sea levels. We have barrier reefs and evaporites inside of them. And so by the late Devonian, looking at the paleogeography here, we do have quite a lot of land exposed, but notice the areas that have this kind of a pinkish hue to them here and here, parts of what is now Scotland and England. These are areas where we had shallow, muddy environments. And notice the light blue also indicating shallow seas. So this is North America, and the rest of the planet started to dry out a little bit. We have some continental readjusting that still needs to happen, but we're seeing more and more dry land, starting out very swampy and then ultimately ending up pretty dry. I want to point out, again, when we'll be talking about this probably in the next lecture, this is really the time when we're seeing a lot of transitions from water to land. So plants did it a little bit earlier, but this is when we're starting to see a lot of animals walking out of the swamps. So this goes hand in hand with evolutionary novelties and what's going on geographically. So if we look again at our geologic time scale, again here going from the Precambrian or Cryptozoic as they're calling it, all the way up to today, and we're looking at major reef building structures. We call these bioherms. So corals are a type of bioherm. They build reefs, but reefs or bioherms can also be made from other types of organisms. And I just want to point out that if we look at the Cambrian, most of the reefs that we're seeing there are made by these things called archaeocyathids, which are very small sponge-like organisms, and that continues in the Ordovician, where we do get some of those early corals, stromatoporoids and sponges. And then notice when we have our first major peak in extensive coral reef production, and that's here in the Devonian. And if you look ahead after that, there's this huge gap in between the Mississippian and the Devonian, and that's when we lose a significant number of our reefs. In fact, most corals go extinct at this point. So the Devonian is the last big coral abundance for the tabulates and the rugose corals. We don't really see them very much after that. So what is a stromatoporoid? It's kind of like a cross between a sponge and a stromatolite. So they're these layered structures, but they're actually layered sponges that would encrust on top of each other, and they're all calcareous, so they're made of calcium carbonate. So we actually had quite a lot of these stromatoporoid reefs in the Cambrian, Ordovician, and Silurian. In the Devonian, the corals really become abundant, and then they ultimately go extinct. So these are a contributor to our reef complexes. We talked about echinoderms in the last lecture and how they were important for initiating ecological tiering in our reefs. And that trend continues considerably into the Silurian and the Devonian, with our Paleozoic crinoids becoming more and more complex. Again, because these organisms, when they die, they usually disarticulate into all of their little crystalline pieces. It is really striking to find fossils that are really quite striking like this, where everything is still perfectly articulated. We still have our nautiloid cephalopods, of course. We still have them alive today, though they're very rare. But I wanted to point out again, the straight sutures in between the chambers of our nautiloid cephalopods are now kind of accompanied by a new type of organism, and these are the ammonite cephalopods. So we have our nautiloids and our ammonites. And one thing I want to point out about ammonites are the sutures on their shells. Just like the nautiloids, these animals would have the various chambers inside that could fill with water or pump the water out. But notice that the sutures here aren't just straight lines like we saw with our nautiloids. They're curved. They have these what we call loops and saddles. And these early types of ammonites are rather simple. They're obviously more complex than what we saw with the nautiloids, but they're a little bit more simple than what we're about to see later in the Mesozoic. So our early ammonites are just the first of many that really diversify. So for a while there, nautiloids were the abundant predator for cephalopods, and then they became mostly replaced by ammonites, but they still held on a little bit. Ammonites explode in diversity in the Mesozoic, go extinct, and we still have one or two types of nautiloids alive today. But let's think about why these shells would have these extra complicated sutures. And there's this wavy kind of loop and curl line. Remember that the original nautiloid shells, I'm going to draw this here off into the side. If we drew a straight shelled nautiloid, their sutures are very simple straight lines. And that's what's holding each chamber together. Okay. Now, if you have that shell and then compare it to a straight shelled ammonite, which has more complex sutures, the ammonite sutures are going to hold that shell together a lot stronger. So it'd be almost like interlocking your fingers together. It gives structural integrity to these shells. And what's interesting about ammonites is we find them in a wide variety of environments in the oceans. We find them in shallow water, deep water. So you can dive down to deeper water if you have more structural integrity to your shell. So it wouldn't keep the shell stronger from like getting bitten or something, but it would keep it stronger from just the pressure of being in deeper water. So this is a very simple type of ammonite, and by the time we get to the Cretaceous period, their shells are really, really complex and weird. They're doing some very, very strange things in their different environments. So ammonites are this new type of shelled cephalopod that kind of almost replaces nautiloids, but not entirely, but definitely gives them quite a lot of competition. Brachiopods are something that we've talked a little bit about, but not too much. They've been around since at least the Cambrian, and they're actually still around today. But brachiopods are kind of interesting. You might be looking at these and thinking, oh, they're clams. And actually, they're not. These are a totally separate phylum, phylum Brachiopoda. And clams and oysters and the shells you pick up on the beach are phylum Mollusca, class Bivalvia. So these are about as separate from clams as we are to clams. They're an entirely different phylum. However, they look very similar, and that's because they're doing the same job that most bivalve clams and oysters do today, but in the Paleozoic. So in the Paleozoic, we had both bivalves and we had brachiopods. Bivalves were pretty rare. Brachiopods were very abundant. Today, it's the other way around. You walk along the beach and you're picking up shells, you're picking up bivalve shells. Occasionally you find brachiopods, but they're pretty rare. So there's a couple of interesting things. We have two major groups of brachiopods. We have the inarticulates and the articulates. The inarticulates, like our lingulids here, don't have anything that holds those two sides of the shells together other than some soft tissue and a ligament. The articulate brachiopods, like all of the others, have a little ball and socket structure at their shell hinge, so when these ones die, their shells stay together. The inarticulates tend to fall apart. Inarticulates have been around since at least the Cambrian. Articulates came around in the later Cambrian, early Ordovician. They become really, really abundant and dominant. Most of them go extinct. Today, we still have inarticulates. In fact, the two images you're looking of the inarticulate brachiopods are living ones, and they really haven't changed much in 550 million years. The other brachiopods take on a wide variety of shapes and sizes, and we'll talk more about brachiopods actually with the lab component. But brachiopods make up a very significant portion of the marine ecosystems, the same way bivalves do today. So if you could go back to the Silurian or Devonian beaches and walk along to pick up shells, most of what you'd be picking up would be brachiopods. One of the interesting things about brachiopods is how they feed. So they're filter feeders. And again, I'm going to try my best to draw this here in the corner. But you've got two valves or shells, and out of one of them you have this little fleshy stalk called the pedicle, and then here's the other valve. Yes, it kind of looks like a man-eating plant, but actually they didn't eat with that. They would open up their valves, and then this looks crazy, but they would extend out this long feathery structure, and that's called a lophophore. And the lophophore is what they actually use to filter feed, and then they curl it up and pull it back in, and they close up shop. The spiriferid, or the spirifer brachiopods, have a very, very long hinge line, and what that allows for is if you were to open up this shell, you would find that lophophore, that filter feeding structure, coiled along either side. Because the Devonian period has a lot more shallow water environments and there's a lot more mud mixed in with that water, if you're a filter feeder, that's going to be hard. You have to filter out a lot of muck. So these guys have evolved more complex filter feeding apparatus to allow them to filter out more sediment and get more of the nutrients that they're looking for. So they're doing all sorts of cool things to try to figure out ways of increasing the amount of filtering that they can do. We also find quite a lot of graptolites in our Silurian and Devonian rocks. Now, graptolites typically are found in these very dark shales, which represent very, very deep water environment. But what's kind of confusing is these animals didn't live in deep water environments. They lived in the surface waters of the oceans. When they died, they'd sink down to the bottom. And they look like jigsaws. They look like little jigsaw blades. But what you're actually looking at is a series of branching tubes. Each one would house a little hemichordate organism. So they're flattened. So imagine if you took a drinking straw or a paper towel tube, or dare I say a toilet paper roll, and flatten it. Okay, if you crushed it flat, that's what these look like. So in life, each of these little jigsaw blades was actually a tube branched off of another tube, branched off of another tube. And there'd be a little organism in there, again, with a filter feeding structure. And then when the animals would die, or the colony would die, it'd sink down to the bottom and they'd get flattened. So you find these carbonized stains of graptolites now. So each one of those, what looks like little saw teeth, was actually a home of a very, very small filter feeding organism. Trilobites. We're still looking at trilobites. We talked a little bit in the Ordovician about how we have fewer in numbers, but how they've become more specialized. And that really takes off in the Silurian and the Devonian. Once again, we're even more reduced in our numbers, but their bizarre features get really bizarre. We still have some that are doing the enrolling and the stalked eyes and lots of spines, but trilobites start to evolve new features because of, again, new predators. Take the trilobite eye, for example. Trilobites are arthropods, so they're related to things like crabs, lobsters, and insects. And one thing we know about insects is they have compound eyes. Well, it turns out not all compound eyes are made the same. Trilobite eyes come in two varieties. We have our simple compound and our complex compound. The simple compound eyes, there's a number of different lenses, but they share a sclera over the top, which is like a coating. Okay, so essentially, if you were a trilobite with a simple compound eye, each lens is picking up a different image, and you have one big corneal sheath to try to correct for that image. So they're seeing lots and lots of little pictures all over the place. However, the complex compound eye that we see in some of the trilobites, like phacops, for example, each lens has its own sclera. And this can allow each lens to individually focus. And imagine your own eyes have a peripheral vision, right? You can do the whole like close one eye, then close the other eye, and you can see a back and forth camera one, camera two. What these are able to do is see individual images, but then overlay them. So they're actually seeing something more like a 3D IMAX. So the complex compound eyes have a much better vision correction and can actually process images not only in front, but to the sides as well. So how weird would, I mean, we have a pretty good peripheral vision. You can, put your hands to the side of your face until you can't see them anymore. That's your peripheral vision limit. These things could go much, much further. Take, for example, this specimen. The eyes are very, very tall, and they actually wrap around 360 degrees. So imagine as you're walking forward, you're seeing the material or the object in front of you become closer. Simultaneously, you're seeing everything behind you get further away. So it'd be like a 365-degree 3D IMAX theater. It's insane. So they have, I consider this one of the most paranoid trilobites ever because they're covered in spines. They've got these really tall 360 complex compound eyes. Why would something be this worried? Why would you constantly be looking over? I don't know, a single, not just looking over your shoulder. They had lots of legs, so shoulders, plural. Why would you constantly be looking out for something like this? Turns out the new predators, and this is one of the big new predators in the Silurian. These are eurypterids, also known as sea scorpions. And yes, this image here of this fisherman standing next to one, that is a proper comparison. These things got big. They got like 7, 8 feet long. Um, they didn't all get that big. Some are about as big around as your hand, but they're not true scorpions. They are an arthropod. They're kind of distantly related to horseshoe crabs. But many of them had these big pincers in the front, and they had this telson at the tail that they would use, probably not for, envenomating or anything like that, but definitely for protection. So the sea scorpions, these giant eurypterids, were the new predator that were probably going around and eating a lot of our trilobites. But since we're talking about arthropods, the Silurian period is when we get our very first land animals. And again, we are going to talk more in the next lecture about that transition onto land. But I wanted to point out in the Silurian is when we get our first animals. And the first animals on the planet to get out of the water and move on to land were arthropods, specifically scorpions and spiders, so arachnids. So anybody who doesn't like spiders and scorpions, sorry, it was their world first. So yeah, we actually have direct evidence of scorpions and trigonotarbid spiders, which had 10 legs instead of 8, being the first land animals, which makes sense. First you get plants, then you get insects and arthropods. If we look at the type of marine organisms we have in the mid-Paleozoic, in the Silurian and the Devonian, we find arthropods, echinoderms, sponges, and some corals. And today we find very similar types of communities of arthropods and echinoderms and sponges and corals in our deep water, benthic or bottom dwelling polar and deep sea communities. So if you look at what's living at the bottom of the ocean in the Arctic region or down by Antarctica, it's these types of things. Now, does this mean that the organisms that we're looking at today and the environment they live in, cold water environments, is representative of what the temperature of the water would have been in the Devonian and the Silurian? Not necessarily. What we're seeing are these are groups of organisms that are what we call highly buffered, meaning they're living in these environments and having a mutualistic community because it works. And if it works, you have a slower or a lower chance of going extinct. So while these aren't the same species that we saw in the mid-Paleozoic, we have similar types of ecosystems. So we can study these and get a better idea of mid-Paleozoic ecosystems. We just have to be careful not to make too direct of comparisons. So we still have our rugose and tabulate corals in the Silurian and the Devonian, but by the end of the Devonian, they've pretty much gone extinct. Going into the Mississippian period, we have lost our Paleozoic corals, our tabulates and the rugosans. However, the ones we do have can still tell us quite a lot. You'll notice on our rugose solitary corals, which we call streptolasma, you have these lines that go across. Those are growth lines. So very similar today to how trees will grow internal growth rings, corals have growth lines as they're growing up taller. And when you see a situation such as this where there's a bend in the general structure of that, that means we had growth lines going this way and they turned. So somewhere around here, this coral was knocked over and then continued to grow up after that. So they actually record quite a lot of history. In fact, corals in the Devonian, some of these solitary rugose corals, had annual growth bands and daily growth rings. So they were growing a new little layer of calcium carbonate every day, and then depending on the seasons, you can see an annual band. Well, in this case, and this is common for an average for Devonian corals, rugose corals, in between our growth bands, if you count all those layers, you get 405 layers per year. Now, if those are daily, that means the Devonian period, on average, had 405 days per year. Now, what does that mean? Because right now we have 365 days per year. Now remember, a year is one trip around the sun. So that means we had more rotations per trip around the sun. We have 365 today. There was 405 in the Devonian. That meant that days were shorter. Earth was spinning on its axis a little faster than today. And we know that because of looking at our Devonian rugose corals, like these streptolasmids. Now, the Devonian is known as the age of fishes. And by the way, yes, the word fishes is totally appropriate when you're talking about numerous species. And some of these fish or fishes that we're going to look at don't really look like fish. Maybe they look like how a 5-year-old would draw a fish. But by the time we get to the end of the Devonian, they're starting to look much more familiar. We still have those ostracoderms, those jawless armored fish that we talked about in the Ordovician period. Those are around in the Silurian and the Devonian as well. Mostly these armored head shields and then smaller bony scales going down the back. We still have our conodonts, another jawless fish. We talked about those in the Ordovician as well. And I really want to point out something about jawless fish. We still have jawless fish today. In fact, these are living agnathan or jawless fish. These two here are lamprey. Lamprey. And this ugly thing is a hagfish. You might remember there used to be a TV show called Deadliest Catch. It was about crab fishermen. Occasionally they would be pulling hagfish up on accident. Hagfish are these little eel-like fish, and notice that thing is tying itself into a knot. They actually secrete a slime or a mucus, and that helps them become very slippery, and that's how they do. They will latch onto something to eat it, and then they'll tie their body in a knot and slide that knot down to give them leverage to kind of pop off a little piece of flesh. Lamprey do something very similar, except their mouth actually is full of those little keratinous teeth. So what you're looking at with the horrifying image is actually the mouth of a lamprey. It can't close it. It's just they swim around with their mouths open. And these little keratinous horn teeth, including on their tongue, and they kind of suck off a little cookie cutter piece. We are trying to actively keep lamprey out of the Fox River and also Menominee or Lake Winnebago. It's a challenging thing. There's a couple of different species of freshwater lamprey that can get in there. There's also an issue when people try to swim the English Channel. They occasionally will get a lamprey attached to them, and so you have to pull off this hickey from hell. But we have Devonian lamprey, and they really don't look that different than today. One thing I do want to point out about jawless fish like lamprey, and this is a good image to show it, are these little gill slits that you see above each gill opening. Okay. So that's how they're breathing, and those are very important because most fish have those gill openings, but they have a little bony rod that keeps them open. Otherwise, the gills don't open. And this is where we start to get our jaws from, actually. The very first jawed fish appear in the mid-Paleozoic, and we call these the acanthodians. So we have the agnathans, which are jawless fish, and the acanthodians, or gnathostomes, which are our first jawed fish. Now, their eyes are a little bit big and a little bit close to the front of the mouth. They've got some weird spiky fins, and they have very, very simple jaws, but they still mark the very first jawed vertebrate animals. So how do we get those? Well, again, if we look back at our lamprey, or our simple jawless fish, lamprey, hagfish, and so on, you have a cartilaginous body or cartilaginous endoskeleton on the inside, and then we have the gill slits, as we were talking about, and then these cartilaginous skeletal rods that help keep those gill slits open. Well, one thing we can observe in modern vertebrate embryos is how jaws form. And if you watch an embryo form, they start out as a little jawless thing, and then those gill slits, we all had gills at some point during our development. The arches that keep those open migrate forward here at our next stage. They migrate forward to make the upper and lower portion of your jaw, and then migrate even more so with the back end of your jaw. Your jaws are actually made of numerous bones that fuse together as you get older. So we can actually trace the evolution of jaws from these support structures that were originally for gills. And this is true for all jawed vertebrates, whether it's a shark or a mammal or a bird. The next group of fish that we see in the Silurian and the Devonian are the placoderms. These which means plate skin. These are similar to the ostracoderms, but they're much more armored and they get much larger. In fact, the placoderms, again, they look a very strange fish, but they do have jaws. So while the ostracoderms were jawless, the placoderms are the first jawed armored fish. And there's one that's really quite popular and famous in particular, and this is Dunkleosteus. Dunkleosteus, again, up to about 10 meters long, so roughly 30 feet long. This is an accurate depiction of scale. And you'll notice even the eyeball on this thing is armored. Another cool thing about Dunkleosteus is from the neck back, cartilaginous skeleton. We don't usually find parts of that. We just get the head shield and its can opener type mouth. The teeth that you see here are not actually teeth. True teeth have to be in sockets. These aren't. These are just sharpened edges of bone that were sticking out of its face. So this is like a swimming can opener. And it's very common to find lots of these little scratches all over the faces of Dunkleosteus that match really well with the sharp mouth tooth-like structures from Dunkleosteus. So we think these guys were actually biting each other quite a lot. They would get into little fits and fights. So most major natural history museums around the country have some kind of a cast or fossil of Dunkleosteus, but it's really something to be standing next to one of these things. Absolutely humongous, terrifying fish from the Devonian of all places, Cleveland. Some of the best Dunkleosteus fossils to find in the world, Cleveland, Ohio. Sharks. We've had sharks around since the Silurian, and most sharks follow the same general body plan, right? If you did a silhouette of a tiger shark or a great white or a dogfish shark or a nurse shark, it's very, very similar. Yeah, we have some weirdos like hammerheads, but tiger sharks and so on look very, very similar. And we actually find that that general trend goes all the way back to the Silurian, with a few exceptions. In the Devonian, we do have some kind of weirdo sharks. Now, sharks' entire skeletons are made out of cartilage, which means they don't preserve very well. Um, but their teeth do. Their teeth are their only mineralized portion of their bodies. So we actually use the teeth of sharks to help kind of figure out what they looked like. And again, relying on the fact that most of them had a pretty similar body plan, we can get an idea of what they were eating. For example, this kind of mushroom-shaped tooth is good for cracking crustaceans or mollusks or possibly turtles. And then your more sharp teeth are good for piercing flesh. And when you have these molar-like teeth, those are good also for like grinding and crushing. So, sharks have a very simple mechanism. It's an open and closed mouth. So they have different kinds of teeth depending on the species, which is tied to their diet. And then we get to some shark-like animals that are really hard to work with, like Helicoprion, for example. So this is the main fossil we get from Helicoprion. That is what we call a tooth whorl. So this kind of rotated disc of teeth. Now, most people know sharks regenerate their teeth throughout life. A lot of animals do that. Most reptiles do that as well. Dinosaurs did that. Crocodiles do that. However, the way sharks do it is a little bit different. Instead of the teeth being in sockets, if you look at a shark's mouth from across view, you've got the first tooth, and then another tooth, and then another tooth, another tooth, another tooth, another tooth, and so on. So then as this tooth falls out, the next one migrates around. So to give you an idea, here's how the shark's mouth would be. Okay, all of their teeth do that. Okay, so with Helicoprion, though, we have some really, really weird structures. So what did this thing look like? We used to think it looked like that. Not that it could like unravel its lower jaw and whip it out, though that would be pretty cool. But that's how we used to reconstruct it until we realized that this is actually more closely related to something called a ratfish, which is a cousin of sharks. And so instead it has this kind of weird buzzsaw looking thing inside the mouth. It didn't spin, but again, that'd be pretty cool. So they've got this kind of buzz-like not spinning, but this buzz-like lower jaw. Probably they could reach out and grab fish easier and pull it into their mouths. And then we get into the paleoniscoids. Paleoniscoids are our first true bony fish that have bony internal skeletons. And this is when fish start to look fairly similar to our modern day teleost ray-finned fish. They're not exactly the same, but they're similar. Again, eyes are really close to the front of the snout. Jaws are pretty weak, but we have fish that have internal bony structures by the Devonian. And then we have this very, very special group of fish known as the Rhipidistians, the lobe-finned fish. This is the transition from fish to tetrapod. So we have, if you look at the bones that make up your own arm, you have a humerus, a radius, an ulna, wrist bones, finger bones. Our Rhipidistians didn't have those, but they had some very similar structures in their forelimbs or forefins and hind fins, what we call the pectoral fins and the anal fins, that are very, very close to rudimentary humerus, radius, ulna, femur, tibia, fibula. So one of the things we are going to be looking at in the next lecture is how we go from a lobe-finned fish to an early amphibian. And we're going to trace that lineage. But these are around at the same time, as are some of those early amphibians, or what we call tetrapods as well. So why do we call the Devonian the evolution of fishes? Well, we still have our biggest abundance actually of jawless fish, which started in the Cambrian, but and they're alive today. But the Devonian is the only time they were very abundant. Our placoderms start in the Silurian and do their most diversity in the Devonian, then go extinct. Sharks start at the end of the Silurian. Their first big radiation is in the Devonian. They're still around the acanthodians, Silurian and Devonian. Ray-finned fish start, that's our modern fish group, start in the Devonian. Lobe-finned fish start in the Devonian, and tetrapods, the earliest amphibians, start here too. So this is the time when we have the greatest diversity of different types of fishes. And a lot of that has to do with such a wide variety of different water depths available. You have shallow water, deep water, brackish, fresh. You have all of these different types of sub-environments, so fish really diversify given those ecological pressures. In the Cambrian, the Ordovician, it was pretty simple. They were all we had were jawless fish, but in the Silurian, with these changing sea levels, it drives evolution to come up with some funky new ideas. So let's look a little bit more at what's going on here in the late Devonian. We have our sea levels falling, not only because of just the regression of Tippecanoe to Kaskaskia, but we also have global cooling. So here we're looking at a paleogeographic map of Laurentia, or North America, during the late Devonian, and you can see we have yet another mountain range that wraps all the way up and around our eastern to northeastern seaboard. Okay. This is the second Appalachian mountain building event that we're going to see. This is known as the Acadian orogeny, the Acadian Mountains. So we started with the Taconic, which was a subduction zone volcanic mountain chain. The Acadians is actually a small microcontinent known as Avalonia, collides with what is now the east coast of North America, and that raises up the Acadian orogeny. And this continues all the way up into the Caledonians. So I'm going to draw a cross section from here to here, and that kind of, we'll say this is A and this is B, and that corresponds to our A and B here. Sorry, other way around, A and B. Still getting the hang of this. So throughout this whole area, we have a shallow Kaskaskia Sea. As we get right to the front range, though, we have this Catskill Foreland Basin. That's all of the erosion coming off of the Acadian Mountains, filling up this Catskill Basin. Now, this produces a really interesting phenomenon known as the rain shadow effect. So coming from the ocean side, we have a lot of evaporation of water. But then as those weather patterns are moving all the way up over the Acadian Mountains, they rain all their moisture out on this side, on the kind of Amorica or Avalonia side. That means going down the western slopes, all you have is dry winds. This is known as the rain shadow, where you get moisture falling on one side, not the other. And we see this today with the Himalayas. Okay, the southern side of the Himalayas is Indian Ocean, known for being hot and humid, a lot of rainfall. And then as you go up over the Himalayas to the northern side, where you have Tibet and Mongolia and China, it's very, very dry and arid and cold, because you're still getting those winds from that weather pattern, but there's no moisture there. And we see this happening with the Acadian Mountains as well, producing this very unique red beds Foreland Basin, The Catskills today are the uplifted Catskill Delta deposits from the Acadian, from the Silurian and the Devonian. So here's that Catskill Foreland Basin, and it essentially is filling in part of the Kaskaskia Epicontinental Sea. So this is where the mud flats are that we start seeing some of our lobe-finned fish transitioning to being amphibians and crawling out of the water. And also because these are exposed areas, remember that mountain range went all the way up around here, that's where we're finding our red beds. So the Devonian is very, very known for its red beds, oxidized terrestrial sediments. So if there's iron there, it's going to get rusted. And that's telling us, and that's where we typically find a lot of these transitional amphibians, is in these red bed type deposits, because they're living in a transitional wet, sometimes dry, other times environment. So the red beds that we see in the upper Devonian are very characteristic. We will see red beds again when we talk about the late Paleozoic and the early Mesozoic. We've been talking a lot about what's going on the east coast of North America during the Paleozoic, but not really what's going on the west coast. And we're starting to see some early mountain building event happening on the west coast during this time as well, specifically what we call the antler orogeny, which is part of how we're building California and Nevada, really. In the late Devonian, we have this subduction zone and producing an island arc. So where California is roughly now, there used to be an island there that was a series of volcanic islands. And then by the time we get to the Mississippi and Pennsylvania, these two bodies collide to produce a big thrust belt, but we'll talk more about that when we get there. At the end of the Devonian period, we have not really a single extinction event, but a series of extinction events. The big thing is that this coincides with global cooling. Remember, most of the continents are still down in the southern hemisphere to form Gondwana. And we start getting a Devonian ice age in Gondwana. Now, this is going to lower global sea level and cause global cooling. With that, we lose a lot of organisms that were diversifying throughout the Devonian. So our coral reefs are finally gone. Sea levels dropped. So are the placoderms. So there's a close relationship between them and these reefs, and that's when we really lose our placoderms. Briefly, though, our coral reefs are replaced by sponges, of all things. So what you're looking at here is a hexactinellid sponge from the Devonian. They were very, very common, and at the very end of the Devonian, we saw these instead of corals making up our reefs. And then as those sea levels continue to fall, that's when we see ecological pressures on animals to try to live on land and try moving onto land, where there's this whole new type of ecosystem to have. But there's a lot of challenges to do that, so we'll be talking more about that next time. So again, in the Devonian, we had sponges making up reefs. Today, you look in underwater in Antarctica, you also find lots of sponges. So once again, that comparison between our deep water benthic and polar communities today and mid-Paleozoic marine communities from the past. So when we talked about extinctions like the Ordovician extinction, the Permo-Triassic, the Cretaceous, the Devonian isn't one extinction event. It's a series of smaller to moderate size extinction events that happen very, very quickly together. So a lot of this is probably due to tectonics and climate and interactions of organisms. So this isn't a big global killer mass extinction, but a series of events that leads to, in the end, a massive turnover in life going from the Devonian into the Carboniferous or the Mississippian. And there's another major event that takes place in the Middle Paleozoic, and that's really the invasion of life onto land. So for the rest of this lecture, what I'd like to talk about is how we go from aquatic life to terrestrial life and some of the challenges that organisms have to overcome. Now, to be fair, this actually starts out earlier in the Paleozoic, but I think this would be a good time to really talk about how that happens, because this is really the last of our big transitions onto land. We have life on land a little bit, possibly some early plant life in the Ordovician. In the Silurian and the Silurian Devonian, though, is when we start getting arthropods and vertebrates moving on to land. So going from an aquatic lifestyle to a terrestrial one. It's not easy to do this. It's not easy to just go from a marine setting onto land. So, for example, here we have images of the modern day mud skipper. This is a small fish that can actually walk around on land for a while. And we think that a lot of the adaptations that modern day mud skippers have are also things that some of these early terrestrial tetrapods would have had. So we can study modern day animals that kind of live in these two worlds and get an idea of how these organisms did so in the past. So there's a couple of things that organisms need to overcome in order to move from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial one. Desiccation is the biggest one. Desiccation is drying out. Okay, so if you live in the water all the time, you're adapted to being completely contained and surrounded by an aqueous medium, by water. But when you get out on land, it's very, very easy to dry out. So plants and animals have adapted different characteristics to keep water inside your body, because that's a very, very important thing to do. Think how quickly somebody can get very sick or die from dehydration. And we're pretty well adapted to keeping water in our bodies, but plants and other kind of animals have to overcome these challenges as well. Feeding. So imagine, something like a fish getting food. They swim around and they actually just open their mouths. If you ever watch a fish eat, if you ever go fishing and you've got your worm on a hook in the water and you see the fish swim up to it, they don't like come swimming at it with their mouth wide open. They get up close to it and then open their mouth really rapidly, and that creates a suction that pulls the food in. Notice we don't do that on land. You really shouldn't go up to your meal and literally try to inhale it. That's not that's not a good idea. Don't do that. Plants, however, they obtain their nutrients, their food, through their root systems. So organisms in general, plants and animals, had to develop these new ways of getting nutrients, of getting food, when you're going from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial one. And part of that is locomotion, how you move around. Now, this isn't really an issue for plants, obviously, but for animals, both arthropods and vertebrates, adaptations for how you actually move on land are very different than in the water. Think about it. Underwater, you don't weigh as much. You're buoyant. On land, it's a different atmosphere. You're at, by definition, one atmosphere. So weight is different. So holding your body up and moving around requires some adaptations to an exoskeleton as well as an internal skeleton. Respiration and breathing. Again, plants have a different way of doing this, but when you look at vertebrates and arthropods, how we breathe is different. Now, fish will have oxygen exchange with their gills, so they just pretty much swim around and they're essentially breathing. We actually have to develop this pumping mechanism to pull air into our bodies. We do the gas exchange and then exhale. And different animals have found different ways of doing that, but it's still a major new type of series of adaptations. Reproduction's a big one. Plants reproduce through things like seeds and pollen and spores, where a lot of times it's very I guess I want to say indirect, right? So they'll just cast out all of these reproductive materials, whether it's pollen or seeds, and they just hope that things work out. So that's the way plants do it. But with if you look at how fish reproduce, the female lays a bunch of eggs, the male releases a bunch of sperm, and it mixes in the water. Good reason why you shouldn't drink seawater. And that is what you make to get little baby fish. On land, we actually have to overcome some of those things. So one of the earliest adaptations is the production of the egg, like the amniote egg, because an egg is a self-contained little micro pond, right? It's got water in there. There's allowing a permeable membrane to allow for a gas exchange, and the organism is allowed to gestate and develop further, and then finally hatches out of the egg. So the evolution of the egg is one of these big challenges for living on land. So life didn't move onto land all at once. It happened in a series of stages that, when we look back, they actually make a lot of sense. The very first organisms to, I don't want to say set foot on land, but get on land were prokaryotic organisms, single-celled, simple organisms, probably in the Proterozoic. So we had things like algae, and other kind of microbes that probably were worked into soils. And this is how we have a lot of evidence for that, is actually in these fossilized soils. You get a soil by having microorganisms break down rock. So if you have a fossilized soil, that tells you you had organisms, at least microorganisms, on land. Probably not in the cratonic interior, though. Most of these organisms probably stuck around more to the coastlines where it was still pretty moist. Plants, the very simple, primitive plants, first appear on land in the Ordovician, mostly in the form of small spores, and then we start seeing them advance more in the Silurian, and we're going to talk about that today. Invertebrates, things like spiders and scorpions, first came onto land in the late Ordovician, definitely early Silurian. We see lower Silurian systems with fossilized invertebrates. So technically the first animals on land were arthropods. And then finally, vertebrates in the Silurian and the Devonian. So if you look at the pattern here, we go from microbes to plants to arthropods to vertebrates, and there's a bit of a food chain here. Okay, the first thing we get on land are single-celled organisms, and they're producing the soil. Later, now that we have a soil, we have plants utilizing that soil on land. Once you have plants, you have the arthropods utilizing the plants, and then vertebrates coming out on land to eat the arthropods. So it's a stepwise progression, not all at once, not all in the same way, for life moving onto land. So let's talk a bit about land plants, because land plants are a little different than what we see in the water, right? So if you ever get sushi and the little seaweed wrapper, that's an aquatic plant. That stuff behaves very, very differently. It can dry out and rehydrate and it's still fine. But most of our vascular plants, the stuffs that, the kind of things we grow in our gardens and our grasses and trees and things, have very specialized tissues, which is why we call them vascular. They have a series of tubes that run through the structure of the plant. So in this image, you're looking at a cross section through a plant stem, and you can see all the little tiny pores in there. And here's an experiment you can do at home. You've probably done it in kindergarten, where if you take a glass of water and you add some food coloring to it, let's say blue or red, and you put a stalk of celery in there halfway and come back the next day, the entire stalk of celery, or a significant portion of it, is going to be dyed that color. And that's because of these special tissues that conduct water through the plant. So through capillary action, it'll pull water up and help disperse photosynthetic products and any kind of minerals and nutrients that the plant needs. So these early land plants that we see would have been things like ferns and club mosses, and later on we see that in conifers, gymnosperms, and flowering plants. So most of our plants today have these types of features. So where do we have evidence for this type of transition? A significant portion of the Silurian and Devonian fossils we have that indicate early plants and animals actually come from parts of North America, but also parts of Scotland and Greenland, England, and Wales. And that's because back in the early Devonian, as you can see in this image, the continent Laurussia, which at the time was made of North America, Greenland, Scotland, and England and Wales, was a pretty shallow environment. Now, remember, we still have the Acadian orogeny going on at this point. So a lot of the sediment that's shed off of those mountains are producing these muddy flats, and they were subaerially exposed. So they were exposed to the atmosphere. As a result, they turned red. They rusted, they oxidized. So we have a lot of our early Devonian sediments represented in the form of oxidized sandstones, siltstones, and shales. So one of the nicknames we have for the old assemblage of Laurussia is the old red sandstone continent. So when we look at our early Devonian facies today, a lot of them are shallow to terrestrial environment, shallow water to terrestrial, and that's where we find a lot of these organisms preserved. Again, our earliest Ordovician land plants were pretty much spores. They were very, very simple. They're very similar to a lot of our modern plant spores, but they're just fossilized in some of the cherts from the Ordovician. So we know that we had land plants, but we know that they weren't very abundant. One of the first well-preserved definitive land plants that we have in the fossil record is from the Silurian, and this is a fossil known as Cooksonia. They're pretty small, only about 10 to 20 centimeters high. They didn't have leaves, but the entire structure of the plant was covered in what we call a waxy cuticle. So if you pick up something like a bell pepper, or even the leaves that you see on some flowers like roses, they have kind of a waxy feel to them, similar to a cactus or an aloe vera plant if you just don't poke yourself. That waxy coating that we see on lots and lots of fruits and vegetables and plants prevents water loss. So by evolving this kind of waxy coating over the plant, it keeps the water inside, so these things don't have to dehydrate. Early land plants like Cooksonia were definitely terrestrial, but they still probably spent a lot of time in marshy, swampy environments. It's not until much later that we start seeing plants developing in places where we're really far away from a major water source. But this is the first steps towards developing those characteristics. If we look a little closer at Cooksonia, we can see some of the other features. Since this thing didn't have leaves, what did it have? So instead of leaves, Cooksonia and other similar Silurian land plants actually would have a little cup-shaped structure at the end of their stems known as a sporangium. And this is where they would produce spores and would let wind blow them around, very similar to how certain trees use pollen and wind today. So they would reproduce this way, and a sporangium would drift off into the wind and land in a wet environment and hopefully produce a new Cooksonia or a similar kind of plant. So it's a very effective way of reproducing. However, you're not really getting a lot of genetic exchange that way. So they're very, very simple, but it was pretty effective. So this is an artist's rendition of what an early Silurian distribution of Cooksonia would be. Notice they're living in kind of a rocky soil, right at the margin of the sea, and that's probably pretty accurate. So this is the equivalent of like an early, I don't want to say forest, but this is pretty much it for plant life in the early Silurian. But it's more than what we had before. Another pretty well-known Silurian land plant from Australia is known as Baragwanathia. These are a little bit larger and more complicated and complex than Cooksonia, and they were actually about a meter high, if not higher. One of the cool things about Baragwanathia is it's actually one of the first land plants to really have true leaves, except they were very, very small little what we call leaflets. Gave Baragwanathia kind of a bushy appearance. And the cool thing is the way the leaves are actually attached onto the plant are in these coil-like patterns or spiral patterns. So it's one of the first plants, and they actually would have looked more like pine needles, but very soft. So small little soft leaflets. So one of the first plants to actually have little solar panels, which is essentially what leaves are. So if we look at an example of an early terrestrial landscape, rather fibrous, small, shrubby plants with small leaves living in very marshy environments. There's actually some places today very similar to this that we can study to get a better idea of how these early terrestrial landscapes and biomes of plants may have looked. Along with that, we have some of our earliest land animals, which in this case are arthropods. They're a little bit different than a lot of the modern arthropods today, but they're arthropods nonetheless. We have common myriapods, which include millipedes and centipedes. Just in case anybody's curious, centipedes are carnivorous, millipedes are herbivorous. So one of the largest arthropods ever to live happened a few, maybe 50 to 100 million years after this time, and we're talking about a millipede the size of a surfboard, absolutely huge, but again, herbivorous. We also had spider-like arachnids. This spider-like organism here, you notice it has 10 legs, not just 8. It's called a trigonotarbid. And then also scorpions. Again, the earliest land animals were things like spiders, scorpions, and some of these little centipedes and millipedes. But remember, arthropods don't produce very good fossils, similar to plants. We have to rely on carbonization and very specific preservation conditions to get our fossil record. One such place is the Rhynie Chert in Scotland, and this is also where we can go to get an idea of what these early landscapes looked like, because these preserve not just insects but also plants. Now, the Rhynie Chert is, if you remember what a chert is when we talked about sedimentary rocks, it's a microcrystalline silica. So you have an aquatic environment that has enriched silica in the water, and it starts to precipitate out. So this is growing around some of the remains of plants and animals. When we actually look at what this environment was at the time, it's very similar to modern-day Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is known for having a series of hydrothermal vents underneath it because of the caldera, so it's volcanic. This is going to produce mineral-rich waters in those geysers. what we call sinters, which is like a buried warm body of magma that will spit out water occasionally. And the plants that grow in Yellowstone in these shallow water, mineral-rich ponds are very, very unique, and they're very similar to what we see in the Silurian and early Devonian. So if we want to get an idea what early landscapes looked like in the Silurian, we can look at some of these unique deposits around Yellowstone National Park. So for example, this area here is a really good example of what the Silurian would have looked like, and that's what we see today forming at Yellowstone. So the Rhynie chert formed in a very similar way. In the image we see here, we have small bits of plant material preserved in that chert. We also have parts of arthropods and invertebrates being preserved in there as well. So someday, in the millions of years into the future, what is Yellowstone today will look like the Rhynie chert. By the late Devonian, we actually have gone from having small plants to larger plants to actually having trees and forests, and our first plants that produce seeds. Now, a seed is kind of a cool adaptation because so far spores and pollen and things, all those need to be near a body of water, but a seed has everything compact inside, and a seed can dry out, and then you can plant it years later away from a water source, and you can get a plant sprouting out of it. So seeds, the evolution of seeds indicate that plants are evolving towards moving more landward, away from the shoreline. They're diversifying more into new kinds of environments. One of the first and best known Devonian trees is this one called Archaeopteris. Now, this isn't to be confused with the Jurassic bird Archaeopteryx. This is Archaeopteris. This looks kind of like a pine tree. It looks like a conifer or a Christmas tree, but actually if you look closely at the branches, they don't have needles like a modern day conifer does. These are actually ferns. So it's a rather bushy, fern-like tree that started to produce seeds. So Archaeopteris forests in the late Devonian still probably in pretty swampy environments, similar to modern day cypress forests today, where you find especially more in marshy environments. So during the middle and late Devonian, this is when we get the evolution of tetrapods, four-limbed animals, from lobe-finned fish. So now we're going to talk about vertebrates a little bit. Okay. And this is a pretty unique transition. It's a very famous one paleontologically. There's been a lot of research done on how fish evolved into terrestrial animals. So we're going to look at some of the big highlights from that today. But first, what is a tetrapod? It's a word that we're going to be using for a little while, so we should get a definition down. A tetrapod is defined as any vertebrate animal, so an animal with a backbone, that lives on land or had ancestors that lived on land. So whales and dolphins and porpoises, other cetaceans, we do count them as tetrapods, even though they don't live on land. They evolved from a land-dwelling animal that returned to the water. So tetrapods, as a group, tetrapoda, includes amphibians, so frogs, lizards, and salamanders. It includes reptiles, so amphibians, frogs, salamanders, and newts. Reptiles would be lizards and snakes and crocodiles and turtles, birds also in reptilia, and then mammals. Those are all considered tetrapods. Notice fish are excluded from that. Okay, so if we look at this from an evolutionary tree, you can see that here we have chordata. Okay, that's every animal that has some kind of a notochord going down its back, such as a lamprey, but that also includes all vertebrates. Okay, so all vertebrates are chordates, but not all chordates are vertebrates, because lamprey are not vertebrates. So with vertebrates, we do have fish, but on the other branch, we have tetrapods. And tetrapods, again, include amphibians, synapsids, which are mammals and their reptiles, and then diapsids, which are their reptiles and birds and their ancestors. One thing you might notice here is most of the time tetrapods have walking legs. They usually have 4 of them. Tetra means 4. Pod is Latin for foot, so 4 feet. What about snakes and whales and legless amphibians? they are considered tetrapods because their ancestors had legs. When we look at the fossils of snakes and whales, we see legs, and those legs were lost later. They evolved away from them because of the new kind of lifestyle that they were living. So I'm a tetrapod, you're a tetrapod, your pet dog and cat is a tetrapod. Technically, your pet snake is a tetrapod. It's just kind of an odd one. So we're talking about fish essentially leaving the water. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, there's a couple of different views. The traditional one is to escape drying pools, that as sea levels were going down in the middle to late Paleozoic, there was an increased amount of competition as these pools were drying up, and so fish started taking new advantageous characteristics onto land. Obviously, going from one drying pool to another, fish would try it. Things like mud skippers and not would always be able to make it, but the ones that could would then pass down those robust genes to the next generation. It could also be that young ones left the ponds to avoid predation, because if you're in a big pond and there's a predator in there with you, as the pond gets smaller, that predator gets closer. So perhaps they left it for that reason, or because there's this new food source on land in the form of arthropods and plants. It could be all of the above. So I want to talk about a handful of these different types of fish to tetrapod invertebrates. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of every kind of tetrapod and every kind of lobe-finned ripidistan fish, but we're going to look at some major ones that really outline the change. So we're going to start at the bottom of this evolutionary tree, going back to about 390 million years ago, perhaps. And what we're going to start with looking at is a true fish. And on the far left here, you can see a few characteristics. For example, this structure in the back. That's known as an operculum. Fish have these. It's the little plate of bone that's outlined in blue, and now I've just outlined it in yellow, that helps protect the gills. As we go into terrestrial vertebrates, they don't have that anymore. We don't have a bone protecting gills because we don't have gills anymore. The other thing to remember too is that your true fish really have more eyes on the outside of their head, right? If you look at a bass, if you look at a shark, their eyes are on the side. If you look at a terrestrial amphibian like a frog or a salamander, their eyes are on top of their head, so the head's flattened. They go from being round to being kind of flat on top. Okay, so that's a couple of characteristics that we're going to point out, but we're going to start with this first guy here, Eusthenopteron. So here's Eusthenopteron. It's a fish. It is a lobe-finned fish. It's a ripidistan from the Devonian. However, this is about as close as you can get to being a tetrapod without being a tetrapod. It is a fish, but it has bones in its lobe fins that are the primitive pre-versions of our shoulders, our hips, arms, and legs. So this is a starting point with true lobe-finned fish as we're starting to see them diversify into this more terrestrial form. As we move up the ladder, our next organism is Panderichthys. Panderichthys is also truly a fish. However, it does have in its back lobe fins, for example, a femur. It has a pelvis, and it also has a tibia and a fibula. So, and then after that, it doesn't have fingers necessarily, but it still has these kind of lobe fins. But we're starting to see the first true bones of limbs, not just fins. Again, notice on Panderichthys too, the head is starting to go from being round to kind of flat with the eyes on top. This suggests Panderichthys was living in a shallow water environment and could probably peek its eyes up above the water, similar to how a frog does today, which means it may have been eating insects or anything that got close to the surface of the water. And then we get to this very, very famous fossil, Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is one of the most important fossils that has been found probably in the last 50 years. It's a great example of understanding geology, stratigraphy, and facies and evolution. Tiktaalik is kind of the bridge between fish and terrestrial or somewhat terrestrial tetrapod. So when the paleontologists that discovered Tiktaalik uh, went out into the Arctic to look for fossils, they knew what they were looking for. So they said, we want to find something that kind of fits in between these two worlds. We're looking for this transitionary fossil. Well, where should we look? And then they looked at some geologic maps and thought, well, this animal would be living in shallow water environments if it's a transitional life form. So where do we have Devonian age shallow water environments? I said, oh, up in the Arctic. We do have some of the red sandstones up there. Okay, and so they went up there. What would we be looking for? We'd be looking for the following characteristics. And after numerous field seasons, they actually found it. So this is why understanding facies and understanding geology and evolution and paleontology kind of come together. So what makes Tiktaalik so unique? Tiktaalik has a neck. It's a fish with a neck, technically. Okay. Now, most fish, if they want to turn around, they have to commit their entire body to turning around. But with Tiktaalik, you could actually like look over his shoulder because he had a neck. He also had a shoulder. Some of the other features of Tiktaalik, again, the eyes are flat on top. Its forelimbs are pretty much forelimbs. It has a humerus, it has a pectoral girdle or a shoulder, it has a lower arm, it has a wrist, has a very important feature, it has a wrist, but it also has these bowed out ribs. If you look at a normal fish, the ribs are kind of straight underneath the body, but in this case they bow out, and one of the reasons for that is to have space for lungs. So we think Tiktaalik actually did breathe air. Probably didn't walk around on land much, but as you can see in this illustration, where it almost looks like it's just kind of like lounging in the water with half of its body out, that's what we think Tiktaalik probably did. It probably would eat animals and small arthropods that were in these shallow waters. So Tiktaalik was all vertebrate tetrapod in the front, and it was fish in the back. So it was really good at doing things like push-ups. So again, true neck, so it had increased mobility. This thing could turn its head very, very quickly. And it had more of a tetrapod front, fish-like back, and those bowing ribs, again, indicating that it was breathing air. When you have bowed out ribs, it indicates that there's space in there for lungs to inflate and deflate as it would breathe. So Tiktaalik is a very, very important fossil. And we'll have an extra credit project coming out here in the next few days that outlines more about Tiktaalik and its relatives. So Tiktaalik really is the bridge between these two worlds, and then we move up to our very first definitive tetrapod, which is Acanthostega. So Acanthostega is it's a true amphibian, and they were pretty big. They were about maybe 3-4 feet long, so that's big for a salamander. They lived in the late Devonian of Greenland, and they have definitive limbs, forelimbs, back limbs. They don't have fins. They actually have fingers and wrists and ankles. However, it still probably spent most of its time, if not all of its time, in the water, similar to modern day amphibians as well. Salamanders can walk on land, but they usually stay in the water. So this is a very well-known and well-represented early tetrapod. And you can see those incremental steps going from something like Panderichthyes to Tiktaalik to Acanthostega, and see those little characteristics change from one species to the next. And then we get up to our next and final organism we're going to talk about, which is Ichthyostega. Ichthyostega is not only an early tetrapod, but it's also one of the largest of these early tetrapods. It lived at the same time as Acanthostega, except this one was much larger. Not as aquatic. We actually think, looking at its shoulder blade, notice how huge this shoulder blade is on Acanthostega and how big the pelvis is. When you have a large pelvis and a large shoulder blade, that's a large surface area for muscles to attach to. So the bigger the muscles, that means they were actually using them. You don't need these in the water, you need them on land. So we think that Ichthyostega was able to walk around on land. It still probably spent a lot of time in the water. We think it probably filled a similar niche to a seal. They probably lived in the water, but they could flop around on land pretty easily. And again, they get pretty big. Ichthyostega can get 6 feet long. They can get pretty large. So here are some fossils of Ichthyostega. Again, the hand and the foot Very well detailed. You can count the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits, just like you'd see on modern tetrapods like you and me today. So that kind of concludes what we're going to be looking at for our transition from aquatic life to terrestrial life. And we're going to see next time how these organisms really start to diversify in the very late part of the. So just as we did with our early Paleozoic, let's look at what's kind of, in summary, happening in the mid-Paleozoic. So if we start in the Silurian, looking at biological events, we have the diversification of land plants and arthropods following the late Ordovician mass extinction. This also leads to some new types of marine life as well, like eurypterids and pentamerid brachiopods. While this is happening, we have lots and lots of reefs and evaporites forming, in part because of the Caledonian orogeny in Britain. And as you can see, we still are in the Tippecanoe sequence, which is fluctuating a bit, but ultimately comes to an end in around the middle of the early portion of the Devonian. While this is happening, we're seeing further jawed fish radiating, like our massive Dunkleosteus. Ammonoids become important, as well as other types of brachiopods. As during we start seeing this decrease of sea level, this continues to promote terrestrial invasion, essentially, going into the Devonian with the Kaskaskia sequence. And then we have the Acadian and the antler orogenies going on in North America, the Catskill Delta, and that's when we start seeing mass extinctions of tabulate corals and stromatoporoid reefs as our amphibians move on to land and plants start evolving into more trees and forests. So we're starting to see a more terrestrial ecosystem by the time we get through the Devonian period, moving our way towards the late Paleozoic, which is exactly what we'll be talking about next week for lecture. Will be the late Paleozoic, so not only the Permian, which is the end of the Paleozoic, but the Carboniferous, or the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian periods. We'll look at some very important sedimentary deposits known as cyclothems, and finally cap it all off with the Permo-Triassic extinction, which is the biggest environmental disaster in Earth's history. So we will see you next time. Thanks.